As a matter of fact, I was having a
I'm sorry,
discussion
Richard.
with one of my colleagues from another institute where he was sharing with me the experiences that he had in regards to NIH audit. It is not pretty sometimes,
Richard, I'm
but
sorry.
let me,
I forgot to record the session, so I'm recording it now. Sorry.
okay. But in talking to my colleague about his experiences, on the flip side, his institutions recognized the need and importance and was able to toss some funding at him so that a good institutional biosafety program could be established. Uh, as a result of that audit, the NIH had threatened to remove grants and stop funding. How are how are the guidelines organized? Section 1 covers the scope. Section 2 covers safety consideration. Section 3, it gives the types of experiments covered. Some experiments will require IBC approval. Other experiments will require approval not just from the NIH, but from the Office of Biotechnology. Here at the college, a lot of the issues that I've addressed over the last few years have fallen under Section 3F. Experiments falling under Section 3F involve recombinant material that is not regulated or come under the same level of review as would other areas. A lot of the items would involve products, plasmids that does not in any way contribute to disease, that are purchased through or collected from collaborators involved in research. The Section 4 covers the roles and responsibilities that we will go into more detail when the Institutional Biosafety Committee is reconvened in the next few weeks. In terms of the guidelines make it quite clear that an institution should establish an institutional biosafety committee whose responsibilities need not be restricted to recombinant DNA. There's a lot of reason for that, in that there is bleed over into other areas of research. And in a lot of institutions, the Institutional Biosafety Committee, because of that relationship, is asked to take on additional responsibilities. I probably mentioned it in some other areas, but nanotechnology, for instance, sometimes fall under Institutional Biosafety Committee requirements and review. The question is why. It is just that the nanotechnology particles are sometimes so small they can behave like pathogens in the way they enter the body. What is the impact of being non-compliant with the NIH requirements? The NIH can and has suspended or limit or terminated financial assistance for non-compliant NIH projects. NIH funding for research involving rDNA could also be stopped if you're considered non-compliant. In particular, it can be quite egregious when you're working with materials that are considered pathogenic or the potential to be pathogenic. In the absence of a non-compliant IBC committee or non-compliant institution, if you're funded by the NIH, you must request approval from the NIH for research involving rDNA, and typically the research cannot start unless you first have that approval. As a matter of fact, they tend not to release funds unless that approval is in place. As far as the IBC is concerned, the institutional responsibility is established in the IBC. Let me say this: the IBC, when I get to talk about members later, it is really considered a high-level executive committee of the college for the purpose of these reviews. And for most institutions, the IBC is appointed by the chief executive, Bigger institutions would have a vice president or an associate provost for research. The IBC is typically appointed by that person. The institution must also ensure that the IBC has adequate expertise. Uh, expertise in the expertise could be individuals with the necessary knowledge. From my experience here over the last couple of years, it has been necessary to reach out to individuals outside of the school to gather the expertise when it comes to reviewing certain projects. The institution should also make the funding and resources available for adequate training of the individuals, not just individuals on the IBC committee, but sometimes based on the nature of the project, extraordinary training might be necessary for the individuals involved in the project. For those areas where institutional biosafety is absolutely required under the NIH requirements. There are certain circumstances where it is not absolutely necessary to have and file the institutional biosafety report, but for those areas where it is absolutely required, you must report to the office, the NIH Office of Safety Protocols, on an annual basis. And it has been known that IBCs has been suspended for not reporting. The institution should also establish an institutional biosafety committee review procedures. Very much, in a later slide, I tend to equate it to IACUC, which has similar responsibilities, but review in a completely different areas. Per the NIH, the general responsibility of the IBC is to review recombinant DNA research conducted or sponsored by the institution with compliance with the NIH guidelines as specified in the section. Experiments covered by the NIH guidelines and approving those research projects that are found to conform with NIH guidelines. Also, by the flip side, should not permit research projects that are not compliant with the NIH guidelines. Among the general responsibilities, the review of containment levels. We'll talk a little bit about containment levels later. Also, determine whether or not the facilities has adequacy for the intended research and that there are good institutional procedures and practices. As to facilities, specifically as it related to City College, we do not have the facilities for research involving pathogens at the risk group 3 or higher level. Over the years, in the discussion of the development and building of the South Campus, it was proposed that even though we do not have BSL level 3 or risk group 3 research at this point in time, facilities should be designed in such a manner that we can switch over should it be necessary. Budget and other reasons, that did not happen. The general responsibility of the institution also include training expertise of the personnel, and I mentioned previously, you must file that report. That report must be filed annually with the Office of Safety Practice. It takes on an advisory role, and that is responsible for advising the institution on all matters related to biosafety, for reviewing and approving proposed use of biohazardous agents. The IBC publishes and distributes the Institutional Biosafety Manual, which contains biosafety standards from the NIH, CDC, and other applicable regulations. Applicable regulations will also include regulations promulgated by the New York City Department of Health and the New York State Department of Health. The New York State Department of Health does have an awful lot of input and say as to how we function. I can recall during my early days here at the college, we had a situation where it was necessary for me to contact the CDC who referred me to the New York State Wadsworth lab, who I gotta admit they were quite helpful during that situation. A little bit about containment levels. Basically, under the guidelines and safety practices, there are basically 4 risk levels. Risk group 1, in the table that I've projected there, I equate that to BSL 1. Basically, that's what it is. It involves any agents that are not associated with diseases in healthy adult humans. Risk group 2 are agents that are associated with human disease, which is really serious, but for which preventive or therapeutic interventions are often available. A lot of our higher categories work involves BSL level 2. That would include, we're working with a strain of cholera. One of our researchers is working with a strain of cholera. And there are some plasmids and other recombinant DNA material that have an associated load. That might very well be pathogenic. So that is required to be handled at risk group 2. We do not have any work associated with BSL level 3, agents that are associated with serious or lethal human disease for which preventative or therapeutic interventions may not be available. I do recall a few years ago, there was a professor who wanted to join the college. He proposed research that would have been at the BSL 3 level. Unfortunately, then it was learned that we cannot accommodate that work. You had to think about it. BSL level 4, there's not a lot of those facilities in the immediate area. There are agents that are likely to cause serious or lethal human disease for which preventive or therapeutic interventions are not usually available. High individual risk and high community risk. Most of the BSL-4 in the immediate 100 miles of here is associated with military projects and not regular academic. The institutional biosafety might sometimes, depending on the institution, is strictly at the purview at the institution's discretion and not required under the NIH guidelines. They might be required to have responsibilities as it relates to select agents and toxins. That is understood because bottom line, select a lot of the select agents are some of them are also pathogenic. Bloodborne pathogens. Bloodborne pathogens come out of the whole OSHA standard, and that's more applicable to workers and individuals who might be exposed to blood and related material. Stem cell research, dual use research, and nanotechnology. Nanotechnology basically is a relatively new era as it relates to occupational safety and health regulations. It's only in the last couple of years that OSHA has been looking at it to put some guidelines in place. And the main issue that comes from nanotechnology is that the particles are so small, they can penetrate the skin without any assistance. What should or does the membership of the institutional biosafety look like? They must have at least 5 individuals. It's very much similar to the ICUC in terms of the configuration. The individual should have collective recombinant DNA and synthetic nucleic acid expertise. Typical animal experts. It's for that purpose that the manager or the individuals who run the animal facility is required to sit on the institutional biosafety committee, a biosafety officer as appropriate. Now, the NIH has specific requirements for a biosafety officer depending on the nature of the research. For example, I act as function as the biosafety officer for this college, but if the level of the research grew where we had to go to BSL-3, then it will be necessary to appoint or select an individual who is a lot more experienced in that area than I am. The qualifications then will require a degree in microbiology or virology. At least 2 members must be non-affiliated with the institution. Now, the NIH see those non-affiliated members as those individuals who are there to protect the community. An official designated certified institution biosafety officer is required when the institution conducts recombinant or synthetic acid research at a scale larger than 10 liters. Typically, as far as I'm aware, we are not operating at such a scale. And as I mentioned previously, high containment level 3 and level 4 requires a special biosafety officer. A little bit about the non-affiliated community members. It says that at least 2 of the members shall not be affiliated with the institution apart from their membership on the IBC. They cannot have any ties in any way to the institution, directly or indirectly, and they must represent the interests of the surrounding committee with respect to health and protection of the environment. Typically, it's recommended that officials of state, public government, local civic individuals, members of civic organizations in the community, those are the typical individuals who are recommended for the Institutional Biosafety Committee. The key thing here, the person should have no ties or affiliation or in any way entangled with the college or institution other than being a member of the community. Again, they represent the interests of the community with respect to health and protection. And typically individuals represent the community attitudes. A little bit about the biosafety officer duties. The biosafety officer is responsible for inspecting labs and make sure that they operate in a decent manner. Here at the college, we do have a couple of locations that we designate at BSL level 2, and we have a procedure on inspecting on a regular basis, at least minimum of twice a year. The biosafety officer reports to the institutional biosafety and the institute of any problems, violations, or research-related accidents or illnesses. I serve on the biosafety committee of a medical institute in the vicinity, and in terms of reporting, in the last year, they have had a couple accidents that required reporting to the NIH Office of Safety. Those accidents involved one needle stick that was contaminated with a potential pathogen. The second accident involved a needle stick with, it was either AAV or lentivirus, but the problem then there was a load. AAV or lentivirus, a lot of you in biochemistry on a meeting use that on a regular basis. It can be handled at BSL level 1, but the NIH requires that if there is a load of any type that could be pathogenic or recombinant DNA in any form, it must be handled at BSL level 2. The biosafety officer duties is also to advise PIs and the IBC on research safety procedures. In terms of the Institutional Biosafety Committee and the ICUC, there is some overlap. There's joint review and ideally collaborative review over certain types of research. Here at the college, it works for us. Myself and another member of the Institutional Biosafety Committee, we sit on the ICUC committee. That relationship works in that we get to see information on projects that might require the input of the Institutional Biosafety Committee early and not much later when the project is at the point where it must be funded. The use of recombinant of synthetic nucleic acid molecules in animals, that's where the IBC and ICOC has some overlap. We're not doing a lot of clinical studies here, but that's one area in data assessment for human genome transfer protocols that both ICOC and IBC can have some overlap. In the next slide, I brought these relationships together to show how they compare. IBC reviews risk to human health. On the other side, IACUC reviews animal welfare. The IBC is responsible reviewing the transfer of genetically altered material, viral vectors, and on the IACUC side, pain and distress from adverse phenotypes, behavioral, anatomical, or physiological abnormalities that could occur as a result of the research. The IBC looks at the risk to the environment. ICOOK looks at the risk to other animals in the facility from the inadvertent spread of the viruses. The IBC is responsible to ensure that there is no escape and establishment of any genetically altered material in the wild, so to avoid interbreeding with wild stock or consumption by other animals. Again, large medical institutions where you get collaboration between the Institutional Biosafety Committee and the IRB. IRB review conducts risk-benefits assessments relative to individual research, while on the IBC side, research for conformity with the NIH guidelines. The IRB is responsible for the selection of subjects and the informed consent process, while the IBC will study the potential risk to the environment and public health and risk to close contact healthcare workers and community as well as to individual research participants. The IRB is responsible for the data monitoring provisions to ensure the safety of the subjects. IRB is responsible for the provisions to protect subject privacy and confidentiality data, while the IBC looks at the containment levels per the NIH guidelines. Injuries and other unanticipated problems is a preview of the IRB, while on the other end of things, the adequacy of the standard operation protocols, facilities, principal investigators, and other personnel training comes under the IBC review. The IRB is responsible for compliance and regulations as it relates to human research. The IBC, by contrast, is responsible for institutional and investigator compliance. I want to talk a little bit of where we are here at City College in regards to the IBC. We've identified in the last couple of months new IBC members, and they will be formally appointed, if not already. The IBC committee will be re-registered because of the lapse over the last couple of years, and there's an awful lot of activity. The committee was deregistered. What happens when you're deregistered? The NIH simply does not pay any attention to and remove you from the list of registered committees. I will have that re-registration completed before the end of the year. A reminder, if any of you on this presentation has been identified as a member of the IBC, a future member of the IBC, I will need a CV to submit to the NIH. The NIH for short form is quite acceptable for the purpose. Some of the items that the CC and IBC have reviewed over the last couple of months or years, it was animal experiments involving potential infectious agents. I like to reiterate that the collaboration with IACUC really works for us, because being able to see and get information on upcoming projects that might impact, we can start the process early of working with the animal facility to ensure that there's appropriate space and facilities to accommodate the animals that must, for the most part, be quarantined and held aside from the other colonies. Now, I mentioned earlier that a lot of it come to us because individuals are purchasing plasmids or other material for research purposes, and the supplier is requiring a material transfer agreement. Those material transfer agreements are handled strictly by CUNY Legal. Legal will contact myself most of the time to ensure that the individual is authorized and approved for doing work at the appropriate BSL level. Only then, only then would legal authorize the MTA. We have had a few projects of experiments involving infectious agents, typically in the risk group 2 area. We did had a project with one potential pathogen that was thought to be a little higher, but it turned out to be fine. We do have a lot of work with AAV and lentivirus experiments. AAV and lentivirus experiments can be handled at the BSL-1 level, provided there is no infectious or potentially hazardous load associated with it, or the virus is not transferring a potentially pathogenic or hazardous load. A little bit about material transfer agreements. The suppliers or collaborators and institutions will require a material transfer agreement before releasing the material. This is where individuals who are making this purchase can be assistance to us. I did have a meeting with the College Research Council a year or two ago before the pandemic, because that situation has been quite problematic, where normally I learn of the issue close to the deadline, minute before midnight, and it does not allow enough time for review. If you are obtaining or purchasing any material that requires a transfer agreement, if you let myself, EHS office know about it early in the game, we can begin the review so that by the time it reaches legal, the approval process will be smooth and easy. I got that help request there. Please inform the IBC when a purchase or transfer is planned. Typically, we learn of this through legal, and if we learn of it from you, the PI, it'll make things a lot easier for us. We developed our DNA registration form that when there is such a purchase plan or it's in process, we ask that you complete this form and share the information with us. Oh, that slide was intended to be a look at the form, but it's not. The beauty of working with the IACUC as it involves animal research is that we have members in common, and the collaboration allows the identification of projects requiring further review. This is what the recombinant DNA form looks like. I'm sorry, of the print probably cannot be seen clearly, but basically it asks for basic information, the PI contact information, and then there are 10 questions that allow us to categorize the material in the appropriate risk group. I attempt to insert some links as you prepare the form and answer the questions. It provides automatic links to the NIH guidelines, which you can review. Like I said, for the most part, a lot of the materials that we do get are exempt from certain NIH requirements, but we cannot make that determination until such a time as we are aware of it and have the necessary information for the review. In concluding, the IBC must be familiar with the research conducted at the college and should be composed by individuals who are knowledgeable in a broad range of subjects, because there's overlap in a wide number of areas that sometimes go beyond the animal research. And if we are notified early and have the necessary information required to make decisions, the process of approval is smooth. We have not, to my knowledge, been audited or reviewed by the NIH for quite a while. I'm not aware of it. Let's say that the option is out there and it could happen anytime. So we should be prepared. Questions, queries?
All right, thank you. So does anyone has any questions? Would you please raise your hands so that I will be able to call you?
Right. There is a question in the chat. This came up previously. Does CCNY have an agreement with other institutions to access BSL 3 facilities? I do not have an answer as to whether or not such agreement exists. I am aware that there was a collaborative project with Memorial Sloan Kettering some years ago, where we had a situation where it was necessary to get some animals into BSL3 facility. Because of that collaboration and relationship, that's where the animals went. But I'm not aware that that project or agreement still exists. How do we contact the Institutional Biosafety Committee? Send an email to ehos@ccny.cuny.edu and it will be addressed. Can you please take us through an example where BSL-1 plasmids are purchased from a vendor? Please include how long each step may take. Okay, how do I do that? If you are purchasing BSL-1 plasmids from a vendor, when the purchase is initiated at the vendor level, the vendor typically returns a document to you asking that you sign off with the material transfer when it is required. If the product is considered potentially pathogenic, the vendor would normally include another form that requires sign off by the Institutional Biosafety Committee. The Institutional Biosafety Committee can do that review quite quickly. When I say quickly, I like to say that in less than 2 weeks, but we must be aware of it early. Typically, what has happened in the past is that we only learn of the situation from CUNY Legal. But from beginning to end, a review should not take and will not take more than 2 weeks. Where do we find the RDNA registration form? I will have that RDNA registration form. I will post it to the forum, to this Division of Science Forum site under administration. We do have a page there. I think the page says laboratory safety or environmental safety. I will post that form there. But in the past, we have been, when we are notified as to the need, we will email the form to the individuals. But I think it prudent. I'm in the process of reorganizing and having more IT technology involved with the office. So I will post that form to a location where it can be filled. There are two versions of the form, a Microsoft Word fillable form and a PDF form fillable form. So I'll post them both. You're welcome.
And Richard, I do have a question. So if
Yes.
a professor is involved in the study of collecting some storm water or waste waters from some water bodies across New York for the study of tracking the stormwater or nutrients distribution and so forth, or pollutants. How do they get started with the applications? You mentioned about the risk levels. In this kind of a simple unknown to them, what's in there, how do they get started?
Okay, you said the professor is studying storm water. Now, the Office of Environmental Health and Safety we have a basic risk assessment. If the professor complete that risk assessment, it will give us an idea as to the risk involved, because it allows the opportunity for the professor to tell us as to the potential hazards involved. That is completed and sent to us. We will then be in a position to provide adequate guidance based on that risk assessment. Specifically as it relates to stormwater, stormwater will not fall under the category that requires an institutional biosafety review. If the stormwater runoff is occurring in New York City, there will be other issues to be considered, not IBC related, but potentially toxic issues, because unfortunately in New York City, of all places, the stormwater runoff tends to be problematic in terms of the level of heavy metals that it contains.
Any questions from anybody else? There is one more from June.
Yes. If we want to dispose of all rDNA samples from old PI lab, do we need an approval from the IBC? No, you don't. We will treat that as strictly biohazardous materials, and we will send it via our biohazard disposal facilities where it is incinerated. Remember, recombinant DNA or related materials cannot be under any circumstances to get out to the environment. If there is any contamination or it was stored in a device or instrument that might require decontamination, we will also assist you in providing those services. You're welcome.
Any other questions?
Now, let me just say that any further questions or queries, we have a general email address in the EHS office, ehos@ccny.cuny.edu. And you can send any questions or queries there and it will be addressed. I anticipate as research ramps up and we get different projects coming on board, I will create a special site exclusively to institutional biosafety. So that is in the future.
Thank you. All right, if there is no other questions, Richard, thank you for the presentation today and answering those questions.
Thank you, Richard.
You are welcome.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.